Welcome, everyone. I'm so pleased that you're able to join us today. Just a quick bit of introduction to myself. My name is Peter Aiken, and I've been at Virginia Commonwealth University for 30 years as a professor. I have some other affiliations, as you can see on the side there. Most, I think, relevant to our discussion today is that I've spent multi-year immersions with a number of different organizations, and both within government and private sector and internationally as well, and really have a very good feel, I think, for what's happening on the ground in this particular area. So let's go a little bit further forward. My publisher would be really upset if I didn't at least push a book or two for them to get those going. But what you're really here to do is talk about, in the context of modernizing information governance, what kind of a foundation is required. And I want to start off by saying competitive data advantage doesn't sound like it applies to government, but it actually does. When people have choices of where to get data from, they will tend to go to the right place or the place that provides them the information best. And that can be a problem or a challenge or an opportunity and a benefit for government sectors around these concepts. One other piece is that when I drop the words modernizing information governance into one of those wonderful AI generators, it produced this. So we'll use this as our sort of theme and logo for the afternoon here real quick. What we're going to look at specifically is what do we need to manage data and information? Secondly, what or how should we talk about information governance? The way in which we characterize it is very important because the more effective and the more approachable we can make it to others, the better off we will be able to sell our programs and to keep them cognizant of the benefits. And that helps to everybody to understand what is the role of this topic in the modern organization. So let's jump right in and get started here. First of all, I'm going to toss up a model that's going to help everybody to understand, at least for this particular presentation, what are the definitions of data and information. And I'm a person who likes to be fairly objective about things. So I'm going to use some examples, but I think more importantly, perhaps this model will show us objectively the way to distinguish these two and how they are really inseparable as concepts. So the first thing is the number 42. Many of you would say, oh my goodness, what are we talking about here? Well, turns out the number 42 in this book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, is the key to life, the universe, and everything. And I've been able to walk around the world for the last 30 years and never failed to have at least some people in the audience that, yes, we know exactly what you're talking about there. Well, that's interesting, but we could also just as easily understand it this way, which is that Jackie Robinson's jersey number was 42, and that's the first thing that everybody thinks of because there was a wonderful movie that described that particular topic. Or we could take drinking alcoholic beverages in the Commonwealth of Virginia, where I'm coming to you right now from, and I could tell you that 42 was my age 22 years ago, and you would be able to do some math and say, probably okay for Peter to do some alcoholic beverage consumption given the right time and place. Well, those are three sort of random facts that I've presented for you. And again, now that's interesting, doesn't really help us. But if we take those facts and also realize that I've associated that number 42 with three completely different meanings, you now have an idea what data is. Data is one fact associated with one specific meaning. And of course, we have to make sure we get that part of it right. We'll talk about that as we go forward. Similarly, we also want to distinguish between all of the data out there and useful data, because it is more important, of course, to focus on making the part of data that we use more useful as opposed to trying to get everything better around that. To distinguish data and information, it's quite useful to apply this criteria. Was that data part of a request? And if it was, it becomes information by virtue of that objective characteristic. And given that, we can now understand when people say things like you can have data without information, but you cannot have information without data. These definitions, by the way, are based on Dan Appleton right there in the bottom of the screen there. They've been applied consistently in government for about the past 30 years around that. The next quick topic is to get an idea of how much data there is. And this is a wonderful group. Again, down here in red, you can see the Domo group does this every year, and it's a wonderful set of articulations. But for the entirety of 2022, Facebook users shared 1.7 million pieces of content for every minute. Twitter users shared 347,000 tweets per minute. Tinder users swiped, they don't tell which way, right? 1.1 million times around that. 104,000 hours were spent in Zoom meetings. Just what's been driving us all crazy. Amazon received almost $500,000 every minute. Cryptocurrencies spent $90 million a minute. In there, and 231 million emails and 16 million texts. I mean, it's just an awful lot of data. And the question to ask ourselves in all cases is, do we think this is going to increase or decrease? And of course, I hope you agree that it's more likely to increase than decrease. In fact, data is the only commodity that we can say there will be never more, excuse me, leverage less data than right now. Thank you, Micheline Casey, for a wonderful statement that does tend to focus the mind a little bit around that. You know, there will never be more, excuse me, less data than right now. Well, that's going to be an issue. Let's talk about how this comes about and manifests. And the first one is just an example of during the pandemic, people were using Microsoft Excel, the ubiquitous data management tool, of course, and not realizing that if they had certain versions of Excel, which shouldn't be a portion of knowledge workers' discussions anywhere, certainly not in critical healthcare. But nevertheless, putting too many rows into an Excel spreadsheet at that point in time, if you had the right combinations of technology, meant that we dropped cases literally off the bottom of these sheets. And these are well documented instances in order to do that. Now, I mentioned before that it's important to measure this data right. Here's a case of not even capturing the data in the first place that they were trying to do, trying to get correct in order to do that. Well, not all data is critical for us, of course. We do want to separate this wheat from the chaff aspect of things. And the easiest way to conceptualize it is to sort of say, is well organized data worth more? And I hope you'll agree with me. The answer is yes, but nevertheless, let's go through a quick exercise to make sure everybody understands and that you have an example to take forward. And the easiest one is to take a book of any form, and of course the book has these pre-information age characteristics for it. Imagine having somebody just hand you a sheaf of paper that is unnumbered with page numbers and certainly doesn't have a spine on it, and say to you, make some sense out of this, please. Well, while you might be able to do that, you can see it's certainly more expensive than if that information was organized properly and that everybody knew how to use the tool. So better organized information increases in value, and yet in this context, our information governance society, 80% of organizational data is rot. Rot is an acronym that stands for data that is redundant, obsolete, or trivial. And the only argument I get here is that it's not 85 in our group. It's it's not 80%, it's 85%. Or I had one group tell me 92% of their data was measured to be rot. Now, the question is, who then is the most qualified to determine this? If nobody's specializing in it, it means everybody's doing their best efforts. But what we really need to do, and one of the key aspects of data governance, is that most people approach it from the prospect of saying, how are we going to put our hands around all this data? And the answer is you shouldn't. The right question instead is to say, should we include this piece of data within the scope of our governance practices? The answer may be yes, the answer may be no, and either way, please document the reason so that others don't have to revisit that same question over and over and over again. I've seen that as a major cause of failure in organizations. This next little quick section here says, well, the data that's left over, then we can put more quality on it because we have to spend less in order to do that. And this gives us a leverage point where we can apply high-speed automation, or what I like to call a data automation sandwich. Again, it's going to be composed of components of literacy, varying levels of supply, and various applications of standards, depending on the organization and where it is on its journey. But you can see that if you're going to apply high-speed automation to it, these pieces need to work much more perfectly in concert in order to get them to do it correctly. And this cannot happen without investments in engineering and architecture. I literally was on a tea farm in India back before the pandemic where I saw a wonderful Deming quote on the cash register hung up above the process that said, quality engineering and architecture work products do not happen accidentally. And I'm thinking to myself, why did I have to come all the way to a tea farm in India on holiday in order to discover this? But it's better to discover it there than never. And of course, the same thing applies to if we add the word data in there as well. The data products that need to be formulated in that context. So why do we need data and information management? Well, we've got to be able to have a very good process in order to develop higher quality information for that subset of our data that's truly worth improving. How do we go about talking about it? Well, this is a real challenge for us. First of all, some really great research from our colleague Randy Bean, who does this survey, and it is right down there in the bottom corner there so that you can see it. But he asked the same question of thousands of people. We do consider this a super reputable survey. And most were not driving on innovations. Most were not competing on data and analytics, managing data as a business asset, creating an organizational driven culture. You can see most are not succeeding here. But here's the more important finding from this. In the same period of time, over the years that he's been asking the same questions, he said, are your problems primarily oriented towards people and process, or are they primarily oriented towards technology? You can see 20% in 2018, different numbers across here, but the lesson is clearly that people and process dominate the problems in data. And asking IT to work on these as problems means they don't get worked on, because IT has very little training around this, very little skill sets in order to be able to do this. And data governance is the only resource that organizations have in order to address these challenges that are here. Why is that important? Well, each year, lack of data governance costs organizations millions of dollars in productivity. Siloed efforts where the same thing is happening in two different parts of the organization. Badly thought out purchases, both of hardware and software. By hardware, of course, we mean cloud now, but nevertheless, it's still a problem. By the way, running all your data into the cloud is exactly what the vendors want you to do. What you should, of course, be doing is putting about 1/5 of your data in the cloud. Nobody puts data in the cloud and expects to save money either, just as an FYI on that. Again, you can be reactive instead of proactive, and 20 to 40% of IT spending can be reduced through this improved data governance. Why is that important? Well, this is a relatively new industry. In the accounting world, they've had 8,000 years and have come up with GAAP. That image in the middle there, by the way, is a beer record sales that were done in cuneiform. So this is how we know we've been selling beer to each other as human beings for at least 8,000 years. And this makes a lot of sense. People understand GAAP. And the first question when you find a company that isn't doing GAAP, you ask why. There are some good reasons, but still people want to know. Well, our profession, I contend, was founded by Augusta Ada King, who was the Countess of Lovelace, Lord Byron's daughter. And if you haven't heard of her, her brilliant insight was that she looked at a weaving loom, although the one that she looked at was big, as you see here in the middle of the screen. And those are the control cards on the right-hand side that actually control the weaving loom process. And she looked at that and said, I think that I could come up with something that would do mathematics for me. And this is, of course, where the computer card, where my own particular career started out as in here. And she looked at this and said, I can do this in a way that will enable me to do math when somebody invents a computer. Hats off, absolute genius on this. But you can see it's a much newer field than the 8,000-year-old accounting profession. And so it is okay for us to be a little bit immature at first, but we do want to improve rapidly around that. And there's an urgent reason to do this, because IT has considered data as a business problem, as in they're like, if they can connect to the server, my job is done. Whereas business thinks IT is managing. After all, there's a title there said, Chief Information Officer, what else would they be doing but looking after my data? And the answer is that data has fallen into a gigantic hole because CIOs do a tremendous amount of value-added activities, but data has not traditionally been one of them in that area. And so we need to repair the gap between IT. We also need to inform the business that our lack of attention in this area has increased the amount of data debt that we have in our organizations. That before we can plan to build on a good data foundation, we have to actually repair the existing foundation, or perhaps even build a new one. And that involves undoing stuff and learning new skills, and typically is going to require an annual proof of value. And by the way, if you're not careful, you'll be doing both things simultaneously, which can be really problematic. And there's not a whole lot of guidance in those areas as well. Very little around getting back to zero. I am the first author of the book on reverse engineering of data, which is a really bad thing if I'm the one that's making contributions. There's lots more smarter people out there that are doing this than me. Anyway, back to our talk. Data debt. It slows progress, decreases quality, increases cost. It's a drag, sand in the gears on your entire process, and it's not quite as obvious as people understand this. It actually is sort of chipping away at the stone, thousands of inflicted cuts, things like that. Princess on the P is another wonderful example of this. Here's the P down here at the bottom of all of these things, and the princess is sleepless at the top of it. And that's, of course, not a good thing. And what happens is that if we build data products imperfectly, particularly at the foundational level, it locks in these imperfections for the life of the application, and it restricts future data benefits and leverage that we can have in those areas. Already mentioned, 20 to 40% of IT budget is migrating, converting, and improving data, and that's a lot of money on the ground, which means working together, we can find ways of decreasing the time, decreasing the cost, increasing the amount that's delivered, and decreasing the risks that go around all of that. We always thank Tom DeMarco for his inspiring words in that area. And here's a very specific example of that. In 2020, American Airlines was valued by the market at $6 billion, but investors on the outside of the company wanted actually to pay $20 billion minimum there for the data that is in their frequent flyer program. The same numbers were evident at United Airlines, $9 billion for their market value, but their Mileage Plus program was $22 billion valuation. You better believe that the CEOs of both of those companies, if they could figure out how to raise their valuation from $6 billion to $20 billion or $9 billion to $22 billion, they would do it instantly. In order to do that, it is a bit of a tough problem. One of the reasons is because we've been going about trying to define data governance in a way that does make sense to us but isn't helpful to others. And so while these are all good definitions, I reject them all out of hand as being not as useful, and think what we really need to have instead is an elevator pitch. And the elevator pitch, if you don't familiar with it, we have a few minutes to explain while somebody important gets on the elevator and says, tell me more about data governance. What is it? And if by the time you get to the top, you haven't managed to deliver sort of a knockout punch of a good pithy statement describing what it is, there won't be that agreement at the end, and there won't be a follow-up afterwards. So what is data governance? Managing data and information with guidance. The implication, of course, is if we weren't managing data and information with guidance, what were we doing? Where are our heads when we think about this? If I take this up the chain a little bit further and get to an executive level, it's important to add one additional word there, which is managing data and information decisions with guidance, because they're not really aware in many cases that they make a decision that has a data implication later on. And so that's an important aspect of the foundation here, because externally what happens is we're talking about data at the detailed level, but when you look at data again, what's the difference between data management and data governance? That's really what they're getting there. By the way, if you don't remember that, it's the old Charlie Brown teacher sound. Instead, just talk to them about your data program or your information program. It's just too much detail to try and get into there. And the real message here is not necessarily that they need to understand it, because then they'll think of it as a project, but instead get in their minds that the difference between a lot of other things and what a program of this type is that it's going to last you at least as long as your HR program is going to last you in the organization going forward. It's not a question of the data is going to go away or that we will manage all of it and it will be better. There may be ebbs and flows to your program as you mature as an organization, but it is never going to end in here. And likely you're going to lay off your HR people before you lay off your governance people if they're truly delivering value around all of that. So talking about it is quite important as well. Let's look at the role of data and information governance now in these areas here. So organizational strategy traditionally has looked like this. Here's strategy. When we go to IT strategy, and the data strategy comes out at the bottom here. I sample Morgan Freeman because he says this is wrong. Yes, thank you, sir. Absolutely. It should look more like this, which is that the data strategy is actually, in many ways, the IT strategy is more dependent on the data strategy than the data strategy is dependent on the IT strategy. Looking at that, organizational strategy will come in, and the data strategy is only there to say, how do we use data to better support the organizational strategy that we are here to serve? And data strategy is what focuses the information and data governance strategies around here. How can we better use these assets to support strategy, and how well is that working is the feedback that comes back. The group that implements this is the data stewards. And to tie it all together, it's important for two concepts. One, that when data strategy is specified to the data governance group and to the rest of the organization, that it do this in terms of explicit business goals. If we're not directly moving the needle on executive charts, we are missing an opportunity here to really contribute. Similarly, the language of data governance has to be metadata, which means using the terms in a controlled vocabulary context in here. And if we do that all together, we will have the ability to very quickly apply resources and assets to things that we haven't been able to in the past. Most organizations think of data management and governance as an organizational data machine. Although it's fragmented internally, this is sort of the external customer, and all inputs to the organization are going to be data. All of the outputs are going to be data as it goes forward. And this is reasonable and the way people should do this. We can't do everything. If it does, it becomes too expensive and becomes purely bureaucratic. On the other hand, if we go the other extreme, too little, it misses opportunity. So it is important to sort of find where we do this, and the primary determinant of value becomes interoperability. How much multiplication can we get out of this? You'll see how it works out very well, because what most organizations don't understand is that your data problems manifest themselves in multifaceted organizational challenges, and they're not recognized with common roots. Here's our data problem at the center here, and it's always filtered through some IT system or business process in order to figure out what's actually happening, which means if we treat these things out at the fringes, it's very much more expensive than to understand with good root cause analysis. We would have the common poor results changed if we put in place better data practices at the center of what we are. And this means that we need to have a dedicated group of individuals with specialized skills to create a repeatable process and develop sustained skill sets going forward on all of these. These are the components that comprise a data community. It's basically leadership, some people that do the work, the data trustees. There are going to be subject matter experts who may not be part of the original group, but certainly are going to be helpful, and then there's everybody else. Most people take the left-hand side of this and draw a line around it. Where you do it for your organization is up to you. But either way, leadership is going to have to get resources and receive feedback in some formalized and attentive session, that the stewards will be responsible for implementing decisions, which means that we're going to have action requests taken of everybody else, because there'll be changes to, hopefully improvements, changes to the way in which the process moves forward. And finally, some guidance around the end of it. Similarly, as organizations grow, they'll start off with sort of a data leadership component here, where they'll say, yeah, we're going to do some data governance, this is great, and they'll get the data improves over time. But when you understand what that means, it may be measured in decades. Many organizations say I need something that occurs faster than that, and they'll include in their data governance an active component. Think of the snail as putting on roller skates or something, that where we go in and actually creatively fix the data in a way that helps the business tangibly understand the value of this new set of programs that we've put in place. If I have to critique this, we've had a lot of really good organizations that understand that they do data things really well. But until we take those data things and move them into organizational results, nobody's really going to care. I'm sorry, it just becomes geeky. But if you put a dollar value on it, it becomes important for everybody in order to get that. So getting started, most organizations get really hung up on phase one, which is usually something like this, get a first series of steps, and then we're going to get to the repeat process. Well, first of all, I'd like to quote Eisenhower here. It says, preparing for battle, I've always found plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. So we could look and spend a lot of time trying to figure out goals and primary deliverables and roles and responsibilities and a scorecard and a checklist. And these are great. You can take them with you. You get copies of the slides, of course. But they don't really help the organization figure out what it needs to do, which is get started practicing. So I say take these general activities, treat them extraordinarily lightly. the process is more important than the product. Instead, teach the organization how to evolve, because evolution will then lead you to appreciate that while this stuff occurs once, and as I said, is important, but not that important, right? Quoting Herb Cohen there, care, but not so much. That really the process is execute the plan, evaluate the results, revise the plan, and apply change management to the process. Lather, rinse, and repeat, or plan, do, check, act. Good old Deming quality cycle that comes in there. So that continuous improvement is going to give us the best results, not starting off with an absolutely perfect plan that I've seen 9 times out of 10 not leave the shelf once it's put in place. I will draw the line one area in particular as a practice. I'm quite strong about this. Do not let the term data ownership come into the uh, into the discussions. Instead, if people say they have to have some ownership, say you can own the data requirements for this data item between stage 1 and stage 2, or stage 5 and stage 7 of the data. But owning data is such a bad idea. It creates many more problems than it does. Just ask the question, what data would accounting own? Accounting gets data from everywhere else, and it's always going to come about and get this. Now let's talk about some governance institute here, instances here. And the first one is such a pleasure to work with a group as fine as the United States Army. And one of the fun parts about the process was that they discovered something in their environment wasn't governed. Oh my goodness, we have to fix that. So we were able to use culture in support of the organizational objectives in this instance. While we were there, we happened to start work on the military suicide intervention project. If you're not aware, even today, 10 years after the initiation, almost 13 years after the initiation of the program, more soldiers are hurting themselves, harming themselves, than bad guys are harming our warfighters. This is an intolerable situation. We've been working on it. We've achieved some excellent results in this. And I just want to relate a component around data governance, particularly in a government situation here. So we were looking at data from a number of different sources, developing maps, and turned out what we ended up with was trying to work from a 30 by 30 matrix using something I'll call the Council of Kernels. And we'll come back to the council here in just a minute, but the process got down to the point where we were saying row 3, we can put a C in row 7, column 7, column 12, and column 20. Just an impossible situation to ask a group of people to work with. And we had a cheat that we could ask of the Secretary of the Army, who came in and slammed his portfolio on the desk after the third colonel stood up and said, "Sir, you can use my data in columns," what we were talking about before, and said, "I got it, I understand here. Let's make a rule," said the Secretary of the Army. And the rule is that this is all my data. Now we don't need to use the 30 by 30 matrix, and we can apply our efforts directly to saving my soldiers. Are there any questions? There, of course, weren't. And that kind of leadership was also conveyed to me by the individual who said, "Please do write this up in a book and put it someplace, because I hope it will inspire others to do this." Unfortunately, I can tell you I've made this same conversation with more than 100 corporate leaders, and not a single one will take this step. Whereas at this point in time, we do have actually a law that helps us in the federal government called FIPA that will allow us to keep all of this in full focus. So when we look at the foundation required to offer good data to our customers that we're trying to do, we understand that we need to manage data because the volume is increasing at an increasing rate. That data is difficult to value, but not impossible, but dependent on high-speed automation. We need to talk about it differently. The existing approaches are not producing the kind of results that we need to have. We need to address the recognition of data debt and present organizations with simple, easy to understand messages that emphasize the programmatic nature of what it is we're doing. And when applying data governance to these things, we need to have a direct link between the organizational mission and the data assets. We need specific, tangible accomplishments, because nobody's going to wait 5 years for something good to happen on this. And I focus on the practice of doing data better rather than on the planning process, which has not tended to produce good results. Again, think about it. We're at the beginning of the journey and just trying to figure out, where we're going to go and what we're going to do. Lady Ada was Brilliant. We're not all of her caliber, of course. And finally, refocusing on data ownership to the organization instead of specifically on parts of the organization. Much more helpful overall in order to do this. I hope this has been helpful. I would recommend one book on the subject in addition to some of mine, which is my colleague John Ladley's wonderful book on data governance. Make sure that you get the second edition because between the first edition and the second edition, many things had changed. So you always want the more recent version. It's been a pleasure to speak with you this afternoon. If there's more things that I can help with, please don't feel hesitant to reach out to me, take a picture of the QR code, or just give me a ping. Thanks so much for inviting me, and I hope you all have a great rest of the afternoon.